Hi, I'm Vivienne from FIGU in Australia. I'm always trying to increase my understanding of what creation is. Creation, which is so central to this teaching of life, this creation energy teaching, which it's also called. It's not the creation that I learnt about as a Christian child, which is basically the plants, the animals, or the natural physical world, the fishes, the oceans, the skies, the birds. All that, according to this teaching, is a creation of the creation, or each is a creation of the creation, which isn't an authoritarian determining might and power like the Christian God. It is a might and power, but it's neutral, genderless, enlivening energy that, along with all of its creations, is not perfect, but is itself striving to evolve to higher forms. What do we love about this scene? Of course, it's the flowers, which are the plants striving to attract the bees, to get pollination, to propagate themselves, to make more of themselves. And then we have the beautiful displays of leaves, which are positioned just so in order to optimize their exposure to the sun. So they're striving to get that energy-giving sun exposure. And then beneath all of that, you've got this beautiful framework, which is all striving to support the striving of the leaves and the flowers. I mean, look at the frame on this tree. Imagine the strength that had to go into supporting the spreading of the striving leaves in its case. And then beneath the ground you've got a framework of roots which is pretty much matching what's going on above the ground in order to prevent the whole thing from falling over. All this is following a natural creational order, and we find the result very pleasing. In Billy's book, The Way to Live, he talks about striving, and he explains that life is striving, and striving is life. In fact, the human being's nature is striving. Every moment of our existence is directed just as much at striving as is the creation itself directed at striving, from the tiniest possible particle right up to the highest form of creation, of which there are many, too many to imagine. All of that is striving. This striving reality that he's talking about is one of those creational laws that's referred to throughout this teaching. In other words, an irrefutable fact of our existence that absolutely cannot be gotten around, and that we cannot ignore without doing harm to ourselves. Another creational law that's absolutely connected with the one of striving, as it is with all the other creational laws, is that there's negative and positive in everything. So in the case of striving, on one side you have the striving, and on the other side, positioned as its polar opposite, is resistance. You can't have the striving without the resistance, and you can't have the life without the striving. So we need resistance and difficulty and errors in order to strive, in order to have life. That's the natural way. And if you think about it, what are these plants doing? They're not just striving to become greater, to feed themselves, to expose themselves to the sun. They're striving against various forces. They're striving against gravity, so they have to have strength to push upwards. They're striving against the wind, against extremes of heat and cold. They're striving against diseases, insects, parasites, and other plants that are competing for the same space and nutrient. So they are demonstrating, as part of nature, the natural way that we need resistance in order to live. And Billy explains that there can be no success without negative aspects being involved. This also means that no success can be attained without negative aspects being involved, he writes, which tag along during the development towards a success. Therefore, errors must inevitably be made so that they can be recognised and resolved, whereby only then can an error-free success finally crystallise. Without adverse circumstances and side effects, as well as secondary influences and so forth, there is therefore no productive and evolutive striving. But isn't it strange that here on planet Earth we have an enormous aversion to striving? We fear difficulty, we fear errors, and we fear even becoming greater. I know that's how it has been for me. It's due to our religious teaching us for millennia that mistakes and difficulties are a result of us not having enough faith in our God and being disobedient to our God. And the idea that we might become greater is just equated with subordination and arrogance, to think that we could be like God eventually. And I can understand how that is, because when I was a child, in fact, when I was a teenager and I began to practice attentiveness meditation directed at my inner nature, at my inner being, and I came to recognise that I, along with everybody else, was much greater in my nature than Christianity would have us believe, I was afraid to let that understanding be known, because it would just be seen as arrogance and faithlessness. And then when I experimented with some New Age teaching as a young adult, I was still of the belief that difficulties and mistakes reflected poorly on me, as if I was weak and inadequately spiritual. If this striving reality, this striving in our lives is the reality, this is what we need in order to live, striving is life, then that is a recipe for disaster. So what is the right way to regard difficulties, for instance? It isn't resentment of the difficulties or giving in to them. It isn't fear of them or bitterness about being inflicted with them. It's tackling them head on and logically. This is my nephew Ben. He's agreed to help me illustrate my point about difficulties.
Having cerebral palsy has definitely led to some challenges in my life.
I'd say so. I remember when you were a small child, sitting on the floor in the lounge surrounded by toys because you couldn't run around like your sisters and brother. How difficult has cerebral palsy made your life?
Well, there was so many things I couldn't do, like running up hills and kicking the ball around and things like that. So it was certainly a little bit frustrating at times as a small boy when I first began to realise my own limitations.
Mm. But also, in recent years, you've really applied yourself to quite a strict exercise regime, haven't you? And I've noticed that's really seemed to make quite a difference to you. How much do you think that's really helped with the cerebral palsy?
Well, it's helped mitigate the effects of the cerebral palsy. It's meant that I'm fitter, but I've still got to exercise enough not to put on weight, and
your overall ability to move must have been helped as well.
yes.
Your flexibility.
Yes.
Musculature. And I'd say that you're probably the fittest person in the whole family, even though the others haven't got any physical disabilities.
Possibly.
What do you think would have happened if you hadn't made the effort to strive against that difficulty and had just sort of given in to the weaknesses of your body and maybe just used the wheelchair all the time?
Well, yes, that would have probably led to a lot different outcome. A lot different an outcome. It would have meant that I wasn't as fit. Probably would have had a lot of health problems later on from just being inactive and maybe being overweight.
And I was wondering, it's obvious that all the exercise has helped you physically, but how do you think it's helped you with your personality, all that striving?
Well, it's made me a bit more confident. The thing is, it's made me probably a more confident person than I am now. Than I used to be. Yes.
And you said also that it's made you more optimistic.
Yes, optimistic and confident.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned also that when you were a small boy, you were bored and it was hard to understand why you should strive.
Yes.
Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yes, well, as a 5-year-old, 4 or 5, when I first realised I couldn't move around all that well, it was very frustrating, and I didn't really understand that I could strive, because how do you explain the necessity of striving to a 5-year-old?
A bored 5-year-old.
Yes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, thanks, Ben. Thanks for talking to me about striving. It's been great. And that's a question for another documentary, I reckon.
Yes.
How do you explain it to a small child?
Yes.
So what about mistakes? How should we regard those? Well, I made a fairly significant mistake recently when I backed my ute into a big palm stem thing that was soft and I didn't even realise it was happening. Now I have this caved in area to remind me that that's what I've done until I get round to getting it fixed. I have to admit that in the past I've been in the habit of engaging in abusive self-talk in a situation like that, saying things like, "You stupid idiot, why do you do these things?" and feeling ashamed and embarrassed. But of course that's actually the bigger mistake, because there's no room at all for self-abusive talk and shame and embarrassment in a mistake. A mistake is just something that shows us where the next course correction is on our journey of evolution, which is a wonderful thing if you think about it. So it's a matter of regarding everything neutrally and logically and just saying, I can say to myself, well, that was a costly mistake. You obviously weren't paying enough attention. How can you make sure you pay more attention next time? Simple. The wonderful spin-off of becoming more neutral about our own mistakes is that we become more neutral about the mistakes of other people. I agree with this teaching when it says that our striving on planet Earth has basically been hijacked by religious teaching, where in the case of Christianity, there's a God ordering his followers to just believe rather than thinking and searching, and requiring the followers to do what he commands rather than taking responsibility for figuring out what's right and wrong, that has the goal of eternal life in heaven, where things stand still and nobody evolves into new personalities with new learning, and that has instillment of fear of mistakes and difficulties through association with sins and punishment. My natural striving has allowed me to gradually climb out of that oppressive world of thoughts and into one where, like a plant, I can reach uninhibited towards the light and bask in its radiance. And be of use to my fellow human beings who have also been disadvantaged by my fear and aversion